But September 12th, right? Wow, what a time of year for us Americans. It's a time of remembrance, and that was going on all around the country yesterday, people gathering at different memorial sites. Maybe people tuning in to watch the memorials happening at the main sites where the attacks happened in New York, in Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., those places. And whenever we come to this time of year, we always, as a country, we hear just a restored call for unity as countrymen, right, as Americans. It was something that we all experienced together on that day, and there's a collective remembrance that we have as people who were attacked, even if we weren't there to be specific recipients of it, that we have a solidarity with those people who were in the middle of it. I saw an amazing picture of Mark Stillpass on Facebook too, and it just captured just the tragedy of that day. You know, what we also just see is, along with calls for unity, is just repeated, or it's almost every year, is some demonstration of some kind of hatred for America. And it just boggles the mind on a day that was filled with so much tragedy already that we have to add to it every year with just someone voicing how much they hate this country. And it's not just around the world, but it's also within our own country. I heard a story yesterday that there was a student in some type of student leadership role at Washington University, right in our own backyard. And another group had set up this amazing 9/11 memorial on campus at Washington University. And this guy, I only heard about it, but it involved almost 3,000 small American flags put into the ground to commemorate, to remember each of the lives that was lost on that day. And this one student, in some kind of, again, student leadership role, he took it upon himself to Friday night to attempt to remove all of the flags. And the campus police stopped him, but he came back on Saturday morning and successfully removed them all. And some people confronted him and tried to stop him, and he just went along and just finished the job. He gathered all these almost 3,000 flags into 4 trash bags, and he ruined the memorial. And later that day, he was asked why he did it, and he said, I'm not destroying anything. I'm using the flags for a more accurate representation. And he described what he planned to do was, he thought a better memorial of 9/11 was to gather all these flags together in trash bags and to then put them out again on the lawn, but this time with a whole set of signs which was decrying all the evils of America. So in his mind, that was a more accurate depiction of how to remember 9/11. You know, when you hear these kind of stories, you just want to scratch your head with how backward people's thinking has become. You know, how their personal will can be so super inflated so that they try to usurp the will of a great majority of people, like this student who thought that his own actions on, just yesterday, that they were more worthy of attention than the thousands of people that wanted to remember the tragedy of those thousands of people who lost their lives. He thought his message was so much more appropriate. And so he went about and he removed this memorial. Right? On September 11th, he removed the memorial. You know, we've been studying the Gospel of Mark, and we frequently encountered these types of strange people. These people who take their will and they superinflate it above God's. And we see it often as they come to object to Jesus without seeing any error in their own ways. And these encounters only intensify as we get closer and closer to the final Passion Week of Jesus, the week in which he is killed and buried and raises from the dead. These objections to Jesus and confrontations of Jesus, they're just repeated encounters when people are placing their own will above the will of God in sending Jesus to earth. And so in our passage today, we're going to look again at another example of this, and we're going to look at it in the verses that are in your bulletin, but Mark chapter 11. And maybe you kind of take out your bulletin or find your place in the Pew Bible or in your own Bible, and we're going to look at one of these passages today. But I just want to remind you about this Passion Week. It's the final week of Jesus' life and ministry before his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And the gospel accounts, they give us so many details about this final week of Jesus that we almost can, let's see, Samuel, hold up what you were showing me there. No, the other thing, you're writing things on. Right, he's got a 2022 calendar in his hand. And in a calendar, it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, right? We make our plans on these calendars. The gospel writers, they give us so many details about what happened during this week that we can divide up all those events day by day and get a good description of what happened day by day. And we've already been looking at some of these days. We looked at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which happened on Sunday, and that's the reason we call it Palm Sunday. In the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at what happened on Monday when Jesus comes from Bethany, where he's staying with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he comes into the temple. He curses a fig tree on the way. As he arrives at the temple, he cleanses the temple, which means that he drives out all of the money changers and people who bring commercial exploits into the temple precincts. He causes them to leave. Okay? And then at the end of the day, he goes back to Bethany to stay with his friends. On Tuesday morning, Jesus and his disciples again come to Jerusalem, and along the way they see the withered fig tree. But when Jesus arrives now on Tuesday morning, they are ready for Jesus. And remember, just to put it in, type of just a understanding of what really was happening on Monday when he cleansed the temple, Jesus was doing a really significant thing commercially, societally, when he drove out these money changers. I mean, in the past weeks, I used the example of, it's like Jesus shut down the internet on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, okay? He didn't want anything but prayer and worship to be produced in the temple on those days. He describes how he was restoring what that place was meant for. Well, all these leaders were using it like a den of robbers. And so on Tuesday, he sets himself up for a major day of clashes, a clash between Jesus and the wicked established leadership of Jerusalem. And on this day, the gospel accounts are going to give us 5 specific encounters when different groups come to challenge Jesus. And here's what's happening. We have representatives from the Sanhedrin. That's kind of the ruling body of elders in leadership over the city. The Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the lawyers, or the legal experts. And what they're doing, it's like they're sending the best of the best to line up to take Jesus down. So the Sanhedrin chooses their best debater, their most intimidating figure, and they send him to Jesus to discredit them. The Pharisees do the same thing. The Herodians do the same thing. The Sadducees do the same thing. The legal experts, they will take part in it too. And the point is that they are trying to get Jesus in some way to either incriminate himself or say something unpopular with the people, or in some other way to discredit his influence before them. But what happens instead is that each time they attempt to do this, Jesus responds so brilliantly, with such wisdom, that they're all silenced by his responses. He answers them with such wisdom that, in the words of Luke, at the end of it, no one dared ask him any more questions. Why? Because they just came away looking so foolish for challenging Jesus. They all tried, but they all failed. And at the end of their attempts, Jesus doesn't let them get off the hook. He goes on the offense on Tuesday. In response to their malicious attempts, he himself will 3 different ways blast them. Their hypocrisy, their own wicked lifestyle, and their own abuse of authority. Remember that on this day is the speech that Jesus gives that's recorded in Mark chapter 23. It's the passage when Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites." And then he just gives them example after example after example of ways in which they are hypocritical and fail as leaders of Israel. And so we're going to look today at the first confrontation, the first challenge to Jesus, his response to it, and then what lessons we learn from it. So we're looking at the first of these 5 encounters between Jesus and a member of Jerusalem's wicked leadership. And we're just going to examine it and find some takeaways, some practical takeaways. So let's first read this passage, okay? So again, Mark 11, verse 27 to 33, it's in your bulletin. Let's read it together. "And they came again to Jerusalem." Oh, I'm just going to read it. Sorry, you follow along. I was not clear. So let's read it together, meaning I'm going to read it by myself. Let's read it together, but you follow along as if you were reading it with me. How about that? So they came again to Jerusalem, right? It's Tuesday morning. And as he was walking in the temple, right? So as soon as he gets in there, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. And they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?" And Jesus said to them, "I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me." And they discussed it with one another, saying, "Well, if we say from heaven, he will say, 'Well, why then did you not believe him?' But shall we say from man?" They were afraid of the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Let's look first at the confrontation itself. As we investigate this confrontation, this passage, this confrontational encounter, we actually could see that there's two directions of confrontation happening that are colliding. Right? It's clear that the Jewish leaders are confronting Jesus, right? That's clear. But what also is happening is that God is confronting the Jewish leaders through Jesus. That's the whole point. He has sent him to confront them. Jesus coming into the world came with a mission to confront Israel's wicked leaders. We also see in this chapter to follow that there's a great diversity of people at odds with Jesus. Right? The hostility to Jesus comes at every segment of Jewish leadership. On this day, he will be visited by all the groups. All of the influential groups within Judaism show up this day and have a problem with Jesus' authority. You know what this tells us? It tells us that in Jesus' day, that all of Judaism's institutions or structures were corrupted. There wasn't a single pocket of redeeming leadership in Israel's structure. Judaism as a whole, in Jesus' day, its leaders were corrupted. There was no leadership within Judaism that was following God, in love with God. And Jesus had to confront it so many times. This hasn't changed. Today, there still is Judaism. There still are descendants of these wicked leaders who run all types of organizations around the world. They have never turned. They continually exist to object to Jesus, his authority in leadership. They have not once turned. There's an irony to this whole passage because this whole thing is happening in the temple. In God's temple. Of all the buildings, of all the places on earth, you would think that there would be one place where God gets to have the say-so. Well, these leaders have fixed that. No, they're in charge here. And can you just notice the scolding nature of the confrontation? All the bigwigs are there. Right? The chief priests, the scribes, the elders, all the important people, they're all there. And that raises the seriousness level really quickly. You might remember being a kid, maybe being at school and getting in trouble. Right? And that's the worst, to be in trouble. And maybe you remember a meeting where you were called to the principal's office. And the principal's office, your teacher's there. Maybe the guidance counselor is there. Right? You're in big trouble. Okay? And for you big kids out there, just translate it into the work area where you might be called into a meeting where your supervisor is there. Okay, the big boss is there, maybe the company president, and oh man, I'm in trouble. Right? These guys come to Jesus. This is a very serious conversation. And they ask this question in sort of a wag the finger type of way. By what authority are you doing these things? Their question raises the issue of authority, doesn't it? By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you the authority to do these things? Who gave you the right to do what you've done is the point. But it wasn't really a question. Those questions that aren't really questions? They're really just statements in disguise. What they meant to say, if you would kind of unravel it, it might have said something like this. No one of any credentials that we recognize has given you the authority to tear down all these tables that we said was okay. That's what's behind their question. So how is it that these persons even came to have authority? Or how is it that people come to have authority anyhow? There's really at least three ways people come to have authority. They might take it by force, take it by might or intimidation. In recent weeks, we've heard the stories of what's happened in Afghanistan as the Taliban army has taken by force the authority over the country. That's one method. Another method are that someone receives authority because they are appointed to it. They're honored with it. Maybe by virtue of their worthiness. They're chosen for it. In a democratic society like we have something like this. We vote leaders in. And theoretically, we would vote in leaders who deserve to have authority. And that doesn't always happen, sadly. We have many dishonorable people who come to have positions of authority, and we vote them in. We give it to them. And then finally, there are those who have authority by right. That is, it's right for them to have authority, either because they own it, or they made it, or they created it. When someone owns something, they can do with it whatever they want because it belongs to them. And so, in this instance, we ought to ask, who is actually wielding authority inappropriately? Right? These leaders come to Jesus as if he is. But is that true? The leading idea of this whole section is that the elders of the Jewish people have rejected the will of God. They've tried to usurp God's authority, and they're seeking to force their own will in God's place. When Jesus actually, at every level, deserves to have authority. He deserves to have authority because as creator and owner of this temple, he has the right to do with it whatever he wants. He has the right to decide what goes on here. As God's Messiah, he is appointed to accomplish divine tasks in this world. So he has authority by virtue of merit. He's worthy. And then finally, he has authority as one who actually has the power to have it. And yet Jesus, during his lifetime, he always obeys the direction of God the Father and waits upon the enablement of the Holy Spirit to do what he could do by who he is. And he's having this conversation in contrast with Jewish leaders who seized inappropriately this authority by intimidation of the people. They show by their own lifestyles that they don't merit the authority that they have. And they are also using it for their own advantage, what belongs to God. Right? They aren't makers of this place. So God is right to confront these Jewish leaders by sending Jesus into the world and to the temple on this day of confrontation. So how does Jesus respond? So we've kind of outlined this confrontation and all the details about it. How does Jesus respond? Well, he doesn't respond to their question with a direct answer. You know, we might say, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he just answer the question? By what authority are you doing these things? By God's authority. He could have. Would have been really easy. He could have said, God gave me authority to clear out all these people because this place is a house of prayer and not a den of robbers. And the fact that he didn't, I think we ought to see that it seemed clear to Jesus that he perceived that this group didn't really want an answer. They just wanted to fight. They didn't want an answer, they wanted an argument. And if he gave them a simple answer, they would have just kept disagreeing with him and started fighting with him over it. And that would have had, the result of that was Jesus would have had to divert his attention from teaching those who actually wanted answers to those people who didn't want any answer. And so Jesus skillfully responds in a way that just shows their foolishness. He makes them work for it. If they want the answer, it's going to cost them something. And so Jesus responds to their question with a question. We've seen this before, haven't we? We've seen this before so many times. Jesus answers their question indirectly. And think of it. When Jesus supplies the option for them to pick where John's baptism was from, you know, it's like a multiple choice. Right? We've got some teachers in the room. Multiple choice means the answer is somewhere on the page, isn't it? Yeah. Right? The answer is there. The student just needs to pick it out of the bunch. And the thing that's so interesting about this is that the right answer to this question is also the right answer to their question. And so all they have to do to get his answer is to answer this question in the way they know is right. By what authority do you do these things? The answer is that that authority comes from heaven. It comes from above. It comes from God. And so where was John the Baptist's baptism from? It was from heaven. He was a prophet sent by God. And his actions were from divine mandate. What God was asking John the Baptist to do, he was doing. We know that Jesus has all authority. He's been given all authority. It's the preface to the Great Commission, right? Before Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples," what does he say? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And because of that, I can tell you now, go therefore and make disciples. So what do we do? What can we take away? What are the kind of lessons we can learn from this encounter? Here's just a few. We ought to observe the wisdom of Jesus when he comes to these confrontational encounters, conversations, because we are going to face the same thing. We need to learn from him. You know, he has such a wisdom, such a skill in the way that he relates to people, to bring the main issue to be the issue that's in the forefront. You know, the issue was not whether we should have an argument right here, but it's whether you've submitted your life to the authority of God. That was what's at stake with these Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. Had they submitted their life to the authority of God? Because it was so clear that God sent Jesus into the world. And as Pastor Jake said it before, are we going to get on board? Are they going to get on board? But to think about this first, maybe it takes answering a question with a question. The second thing is, I think we observe that the compromising problems of wicked leaders, that they cannot give the truth because the truth exposes their wickedness. Right? Jesus asked them a question, a really simple question. You know, what their response is, it's almost like the Family Feud. You know the Family Feud? Okay. Right? Simple questions, give an answer. Okay, and survey says, let's see how your answer compares. Okay. But in the Family Feud, they all get in a huddle. What are we going to say? What are we going to say? What do you mean, what are you going to say? What's the answer? Why do we need to come up with consensus? It's because wicked leaders are compromised by the truth. You know, they have to have a scheme with their answers. Because if they were to just to give the truth, they'd end up exposing that they were culpable for bad decisions as part of it. And maybe even of telling lies. Can't tell the truth, because everyone will know that we were telling lies before. You know, and we're going to face this throughout our lifetime. Being in contexts where there's leaders and they tell us lies. And they don't want to tell us the truth. And we ought to be able to discern the difference. And also not to expect that they will tell us a straight answer. If they can't give us a straight answer, it's because they're hiding something. Right? We ought to just learn from Jesus to have discernment of what's going on. Something else. We ought to observe the amount of work the wicked go to cover their tracks and to turn away from that path ourselves. Right? These guys are living a life where everything that they do, they have to think about a scheme of, well, how do I say this? How do I answer this question? What do I do here? Because I've got to cover so many tracks of my life that are compromised with evil and wickedness. And it's just an appeal to us as believers to say, we're going to go a different way. The truth may hurt, but it's the truth. It keeps us from a life that's so entangled and so complicated because we're always trying to cover our tracks. Let's not go that way. Another point is that being a friend of the truth instantly makes you the authority in the room. If you are the friend of truth, you are the authority in the room, no matter how long the line is to object to you. Jesus doesn't have to scheme with his answers. He just is a friend of the truth. Another observation, that those who do wickedness operate according to a secretive and distorted set of reasoning. Right? The way they answer their question is not, well, what is the true answer? It's what is the best answer for us. To the righteous, we can see that they are unreasonable or that their reason is compromised. And we're going to deal with people like this throughout our life. How do we deal with those who've abandoned righteousness and so that they're so confused in their reasoning? Or maybe said it another way, if this student from Wash U showed up today, the one that tore down how would you begin to talk to that guy? knowing what kind of mess is going on in his brain. The distortion of thinking that he's come to believe. Well, Jesus set an example of requiring wicked people to need to expose their wickedness to be able to be on the path of truth. You have to learn to deal with these type of people that draws them to the truth. And then just to know that we're going to deal with wicked rulers ourselves who have authority. People who, through whatever means, have somehow been able to be put into positions of authority. And because of that, we need great wisdom. The New Testament calls us to pray for our leaders because of it. And what are we praying for? We're praying that they would choose righteousness and reject unrighteousness. That they would choose the truth and reject lies. That they would choose responsibility and reject the path that seems to get them off the hook. And man, do we need that right now. So we need to pray for our leaders, that they themselves would be ministers of righteousness. But we also ought to take great care, and the Proverbs help us here, that we not entangle our lives with wicked people. When it comes to matters of business or entering into contracts or even just the way our lifestyles come together. There's a great balance between reaching the lost and joining in lostness. Right? There's a distinction between it. And the final lesson of this section is that Jesus wants to remind the wicked and remind the righteous that the wicked will not get off the hook in the end, that there is a coming judgment. You know, these leaders, they answer the question finally with, we don't know. We don't know. Sometimes we have conversations with our own boys where we're trying to pull out from them, why did you do what you did? And they often revert to the answer, I don't know. Right? It seems to be like a safe answer. Jesus is saying, you're not going to be able to say, we don't know forever. And the way that he does that is by telling a final parable. And this is how we're going to end the sermon today, is just remembering this parable. I'm just going to read it for you, and you follow along. But it's the verses that follow in chapter 12. Jesus says, and he began to speak to them in parables. And here's one of these parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower. Right, it's a lot of work. Okay? And then he leased it to tenants. So he rented it out. And then he went into another country. All right, so when it comes to parables, you want to make some identifications of who are these people. Who does the man who planted the vineyard represent? He represents God. And who do the tenants represent in the story? The leaders of Israel. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. All right, so that's the deal, is I own the vineyard, I prepare the vineyard, and then I rent it out to you. I get to be hands-free in retirement. And all you need to do is you just need to keep a little bit of that, a portion of that food, send it my way. Deal? You get to keep the rest? Right? And so he sends a servant to collect some of the rent, to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and they beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Well, that's not the deal. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And so with many others, some they beat and some they killed. in the story, who are the servants? And the answer is the prophets of Israel that God had sent throughout Israel's history. The story goes on. He had still one other, right? The maker, the owner of the vineyard. He had still one other, a beloved son. And who does this son represent? Jesus. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and this whole place will be ours. The inheritance will be ours." And they took him, and they killed him, and they threw him out of the vineyard. And so the story, Jesus asks, what will the owner of the vineyard do? Answer, he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is Psalm 118. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away. The end of the conversation. You know, it seemed along the way that there was some confusion in their hearts about what Jesus was saying, but by the end, they got it. Crystal clear, Jesus, what you're saying. But did they repent? Did they turn away from their plotting? No, they did not. But you can. You can. If you've been waging a war, a battle in your heart against God, if you've been asking these types of questions, God, how do you think that you have authority in my life to decide for me what is best? You can turn away from that wicked path. And it's really an invitation to you today. If you're here and that's been behind the scenes of what's going on in your heart, or if you're on the Zoom and that's been the reality of what's going on in your heart, you can turn. You can turn because God sent his Son into the world because he loved the world, so that whoever believes in him wouldn't perish, but would have eternal life. And we're going to remember this way that God did this through our celebration of the Lord's Supper. I'm going to ask Pastor Jake to come and lead us in our remembrance of it.